What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time excited to bring you my launch review of Baldur's Gate 3. This time, right as the embargo lifts, which should be right when the game is launching as well. However, with no preloading available, you might be checking this out while the game is finishing downloading, which of course means that I was provided a review copy for this ahead of time, which I've had in my hands for about 5 days at the time of this video, though more specifically, I got it on Sunday at about noon. Which surprised me a little bit. I was not expecting to get one, but with the short window, it's pretty much all I've been doing the past few days, which is how I was able to complete a full playthrough ahead of time. Normally, I would review a game after 100%, but this game is massive and that is going to take me months. That is still coming, that is still happening, but because it's going to take so long, this time we're doing a launch review since I've played the entire thing and can share my full thoughts. The last thing I want to mention here before we actually dive into this, however, is that I won't be talking about any spoilers in particular. I will be trying to keep those to a minimum, though what I would consider a spoiler and what somebody else considers a spoiler might not exactly line up, which means there might be some contextual stuff in the footage as no one has really seen much of this game in person at the moment, which means that some of the footage could qualify as a potential spoiler, so certainly keep that in mind. From there, though, let's actually get into this. Baldur's Gate 3 is aiming to push CRPGs to the height of what they can be, and in many ways I think they succeeded at that. However, there are a few small hiccups which we're absolutely going to get into, because the game is by no means perfect, because nothing is. However, while we will talk about a few of those problems that I ran into over the course of this review, I do think that Larian Studios has largely succeeded at what they were trying to do here, as even from one playthrough, the size and scope of this is immense, and I can tell already I'll be playing through this probably a dozen times. That said, on the subject of a playthrough, I mentioned I played through this one full time. That took me about 50 hours, though I would not expect that for everyone. I played this game a lot in early access, which means I was able to fly through the first act of the game very quickly while not really missing anything at all. And I also specialize in this particular type of video game, as CRPGs are near and dear to me. So with that in mind, I think Larian's own estimate of probably 70 to 80 hours for a full playthrough is much more likely for people who don't do this for a living. I also played the game all the way through on normal, trying to see as much of the game as I possibly could in one go. That means swapping out origin characters all the time, mixing up my party to see what they had going on quest-wise, trying to do everything before I moved on, etc. And while I by no means saw everything, because this isn't the type of game you can possibly see in one playthrough, I do have a pretty solid understanding of how things work and how all the pieces fit together now. That said, I like to kick off newly released games with a mention about how the game is working on a technical level, as I imagine that is forefront in people's mind right now, as we do not see how it is performing for everyone here on PC for its initial release, though do keep in mind this is coming to PlayStation 5 later in September. For PC, however, speaking for myself, I have a very high-end PC. I will try to put the specs in the description below, and if I don't remember to do it, they're on the channel's About page. On the technical side of things, I want to start this off by mentioning that I did not encounter anything game-breaking, but I did encounter a variety of issues, especially in the later parts of the game, that bear a mention. That said, the first part of the game, which was in early access for almost 3 years, was just about flawless. I didn't really have any problems there at all. Once I started getting to the later parts of the game is where I noticed the frequency of these things ramping up a bit. Probably the most consistent problem by far was frame rate drops. This happened to varying degrees everywhere in the game, but was by far the most pronounced in the city of Baldur's Gate, which is the last act or so of the game, and once I got to there, it became a pretty consistent issue where I'd play for a couple hours, the frame rate problem would start up and be persistent until I just relaunched the game, at which point it would clear up for a while before eventually coming back, which could certainly get a little frustrating at times. However, the game did crash in a handful of instances, though this was much more rare. And then, while less impactful to the game overall, there were a variety of minor bugs I would run into, like dialogue options just missing. There wasn't a bit of text to go along with the button to press for that dialogue option. I also ran into items that had a text string for a description instead of the actual actual description, or like I'd click on a book and it would just have like a file name inside of it instead of whatever text was supposed to be in said book, alongside a variety of other minor bugs. I will tell you though that that is better than I was expecting it to be. As someone who plays a lot of these types of games, CRPGs are notoriously buggy on release, especially the back halves that don't usually get tested as much. And while we can certainly see some of that here as I just explained, as I also mentioned right at the beginning of this section, I did not run into anything game-breaking. While there were plenty of things that sort of broke my immersion, I was able to complete and do everything I wanted to do. There were just some hiccups along the way, and for a CRPG, that's pretty remarkable. And considering that most of that is in the later areas of the game, there's a good chance that a lot of people won't see that for quite some time, as the beginning area, again, is very polished. So make of that what you will. Moving on from there though, I want to talk a little bit about the difficulty of the game, because there are 3 of them: Explorer, Balanced, and Tactician. However, a couple things to note here is that this is a game that focuses more on role-playing than being extremely difficult. So even the Balanced mode was very easy for me as someone who plays a ton of these types of games. If you're not familiar with 5th edition D&D, which we'll talk a bit more about in the combat section, you might have more of a challenge on the Balanced mode, but if you're familiar with that rule set and know how to build an effective party, you can overcome normal difficulty without even really trying to min-max or anything or doing anything special. However, if that's still a little too much for you, if you're new to the game altogether, you can pick Explorer, which is a much easier experience. Now, I did mess around a little bit with Tactician, just comparing the differences between normal and it, and on Tactician, you'll often run into encounters where there are simply more enemies, and the enemies that are there seem to actively try to kill you, as opposed to just down your character, meaning that more or less the AI is a little more ruthless on Tactician, though that is something I will probably expand more on in my 100% review, because as of this moment I only messed around with it a little bit. Though again, do keep in mind that this game is huge into the story and the characters you are interacting with and their stories, and combined with an already very approachable rule set makes this a very welcoming game to beginners for the genre. Probably one of the best in that regard, truth be told. And this is probably a great place to mention that they reworked the tutorial from the early access period as well. It is significantly shorter, and they do a much better job of tutorializing you at the same time. So just another way the game is very approachable. From there though, let's talk story. As I mentioned, I'm not going crazy in depth here. However, there are a few broad mentions that I want to talk about both as a fan of the genre and the series, meaning the previous games. And while none of that should spoil you on this game, if you want to play it safe, this video should be timestamped. You might want to jump ahead here. Now, as many people already know, the basic plot setup is that we get captured by mind flayers and infected with a mind flayer tadpole that should theoretically turn us into a mind flayer ourselves. Obviously, no one wants to burst into a mind flayer unexpectedly and lose their free will, so that's a pretty pressing issue that would like to get cured. In doing so, we will run across a much larger plot which, alongside the tadpole, makes up the bulk of the story, or at least the main story. From there, a few just general points about it. For starters, they slightly reframed it compared to the early access. And again, this is an area where it's hard to talk about without spoiling it, but the context of the tadpole and its effect on you in the game has been changed. For instance, the early access had a part right after character creation where you made a second character that was supposed to be like the person your character dreams about. However, now this is along the lines of you needing a guardian instead. So that whole bit of the plot, while still essentially the same, it feels like, just got a slight tweaking to feel a little better, which personally I appreciated a lot. Beyond that, a common thing that came up with this game in particular was how does it relate to Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, and does it carry forth that name? I will not go into specifics, of course, but I can confidently say, as someone who has played the previous 2 games extensively, reviewed both of them, made a new player's guide for them, alongside story supercuts, this game absolutely connects to those previous games in what I would consider a very direct way. Even beyond just the literal plot connecting, the story itself uses much of the same structure, with us starting away from the city itself and then over the course of a journey arriving at the city where the plot threads all came together, such as we saw in the first game. There are also loads of returning characters, many of which show up in surprising places, which I enjoyed immensely. I think they did a really good job with that, and they also captured the essence of what those characters were to begin with in the previous games, and because of that, I can say that they did a better job with that than I was honestly expecting them to. However, on that note, I will say that they play it a little loose with the timeline of events directly before the game. I don't want to get too deep into lore nerd stuff here because it doesn't make much of a difference. And ultimately, I'm fine with it as it is a fantasy game, so I think hand-waving a few of the last decades of major events in terms of the exact timing isn't a big deal. But something I noticed as someone who's really into this is that some of the timing of the events leading up to this game have been made very, very vague in order to fit this story, which is probably the right move, honestly. If anything, I do think the game is better for it, but something to keep in mind. The story overall had a couple of what I would consider weaker moments, mostly towards the later part of the game, which might have simply been down to some of the bugs I was experiencing. However, broadly speaking, I loved the story. I was very impressed with it. The cinematics and everything are remarkable, and the way the game responds to the things you've done up to that point and culminates into this big moment where everything you've done is represented left me feeling incredibly satisfied with how this game ended. I was thrilled about it. This game nails choice and consequence. The reactivity of it is something I was expecting, as Larian's previous game, Original Sin 2, did reactivity incredibly well. However, what that game struggled with was long-lasting consequences. It seems like with Baldur's Gate 3, they also nailed the consequences part of it on top of the reactivity. And because of that, I can tell this is a game I'm probably going to play through a dozen times before you guys see that 100% review at the very least. And that includes save scumming all the various ways you can play out situations through those playthroughs. So if you couldn't tell, I'm very excited about what they did here narratively. From there though, let's talk character creation. So a few things to note about character creation right away are that it is of course the updated version that we saw recently with the new UI and everything, but a few notes on this. For starters, they added in a lot of the options we were expecting, but I did notice they also took a few away. For instance, a cleric had some of the deities removed. You can no longer be a cleric of one of the dead three gods, for instance. Though most of the changes here I can see why they made them. Beyond that, we can make a completely custom character, or we can pick up an origin character, which is to say a character that would otherwise be a companion if we're not playing them outside of the customizable one called the Dark Urge, who is limited to only your character. Now, the reason you might want to play an origin character as opposed to a custom character is because they are directly tied to the story. They have their own personal story that ties in with the rest of the plot. So if you play as them, you'll get a little extra story content that you wouldn't otherwise. And while I've got videos explaining each of these characters a bit more in depth, you can play an introduction directly in character creation, showing you what this origin character is all about and giving you a basic idea of who they are. However, outside of the Dark Urge, you cannot edit the appearance of any of the origin characters. They are a set character. However, you can respec their class. For instance, Will is typically a warlock, but you can make him any class you want after you get into the game a little bit and find the character who can respec you or raise your dead companions, that kind of thing, which I feel is important information to people. However, because these origin characters have stories, some of which are tied to their base class, respecking them into something else or just respecking them to fit your party, as if you are playing a warlock, maybe you don't want to bring Will along as a second warlock in a party size of 4, you can definitely do that. Just keep in mind that this might cause a few issues with that particular character's story, but it's not going to be a big deal, and I wouldn't let it stop you from playing the way you want to play. Now, in terms of the rest of the details for character creation outside of things like the addition of body types, etc., and just more options in general to make the character you want to make, there's also picking your class and all of the abilities that go with that. I've already made videos on all of those, but the monk is coming out tomorrow. So if you want more information, I would go watch those videos, as this is just too much to cover here in this review. But while I love the way they implemented these classes and everything they do, there are a few things here and there I would have liked to seen changed. I am also a little bit on the fence about this new UI, and that is purely because if you click the big proceed button down at the bottom, the game will actually just take you to the next part of the introduction or throw you into the tutorial potentially, which means you might not realize that on the left side of the screen, that's where you're clicking through the check marks to make sure that you're customizing your character the way you want. And then that stuff on the left side of the screen isn't your appearance. Your edit appearance button, of course, is down there on the middle left. And while I like the general layout and information presentation, I do think they have a few changes here they could adjust to make this a little bit more player friendly. But that is admittedly an incredibly minor gripe. Ultimately, though, you should be able to make a character you're really happy with, though do keep in mind this isn't like Fallout 4 levels of face adjustments, though there are a ton of options for you to choose from, so you'll likely find something you enjoy. With that in mind, let's talk progression systems. Progression in this game is divided up into a few different systems, but the biggest, of course, being leveling up. Leveling up follows mostly the 5th edition class rule sets with a few adaptations made to fit the game. That said, there is a level 12 cap, of course, which has been widely known up to this point. And while I won't bore you with the level up process for every class or anything, I will say that the 12 level spread across the game felt a lot better than I was expecting it to, because as someone who plays a lot of these games, typically they'll go to the max, which with this rule set would be 20. However, by the time you get to level 12, you're already going to be very powerful in the realm of these games. And as we'll get into a bit later, you can already do some really broken stuff, so I don't think it was necessary to go higher. But with the relatively low cap and being able to end Act 1 at like level 6 or 7, there was some concern about how it would feel leveling up across the game. And I'm happy to report that I think they did a good job here. I got to level 12 about halfway through the last act of the game, which gave me plenty of time to experience a full-powered character, while also not having me max level at like halfway through the game and just kind of ending the progression. So I really do think they nailed that part of it. Now, another form of progression is the Illithid skill tree. We have a tadpole in our head, and if you are the type that is tempted by power, you can potentially find more of these tadpoles, consume them, and unlock extra powers at the risk of corrupting yourself. As generally speaking, being a mind flayer is not something people aspire to. However, getting these powers can give you massive boons on top of what your class can do. And I will say, I played through this entire game without touching the Illithid powers until the very end where I just reloaded a save and used all of them at once just to see what it was like. But even with completely normal characters that were not using any of these powers, I was tearing this game apart on normal. So don't feel like you have to use these. But I will say, the skill tree is the tip of the iceberg. There is more to this system that I can't talk about without outright spoiling it, but there are absolutely a couple more points to be made about this that might be better served in a different video. Pretty cool system overall. Another point of progression, though, is of course the gear we have. So right away in Act 1, we can already find and see some items that were not in early access, which was pretty cool, but most of those are pretty tame. I did find that around Act 2 is where I started to really find a lot of awesome items, and in fact, my main character's weapon was a great sword that I found in Act 2 that I then used for the rest of the game. But point blank, the game throws a ton of loot at you. A lot of it has really cool effects. Some stuff will just outright boost your ability scores to make you better in combat. Others will have unique things that add damage to what you do. And there's so much cool stuff. I'm excited to see what the community does in terms of cheese with these. But still, very cool itemization. Now, before we move on, as I mentioned, progression-wise on normal, as someone who knew what I was doing, even playing through this for the first time, I was way overpowered, and I wasn't even using the really strong abilities, some of which I actually obtained through side quest rewards, and the example I want to use here is later in the game, by completing one particular side quest, I got a reward that gave me an ability to summon 6 ghouls all at once, but these ghouls also had the extra effect of potentially paralyzing anything they hit, and because 5th edition D&D is a game ruled by the action economy, that ability, which replenished on a short rest, which is almost nothing, was basically an I win button for the rest of the game. It was ridiculous. There were a couple fights where the paralyzation just didn't work because things were immune to it, but in almost every other instance, that ability was capable of carrying me through the rest of the game. But realistically, even that wasn't that necessary. And I tell you all that to mention that if you are a veteran of these types of games, you might want to just shoot for tactician out of the gate. Though that brings us to combat. I made a video going over the basics of combat just a few days ago. If you want to learn more about it, go watch that video. Here in this video, I want to talk about some of the tweaks and changes they made that make this a better overall experience, because ultimately, this is based on 5th edition D&D, and that is a tabletop rule set, so some adaptations were necessary to make that feel fun in the actual game. And I was very, very pleasantly genuinely surprised at how much stuff they were able to outright port into the game in some way, on top of how they made adjustments to various class features and things to make them fit, such as the Ranger got a revamp to some of their skills that were more roleplay focused in the tabletop version, meaning that in a video game they wouldn't mechanically do anything. So right away, if you're worried that your class has something that wouldn't translate to a video game, I would tell you to go ahead and give it a shot, because in almost every instance where I thought that would be a problem, I ran into something I felt was really well imagined. To give an example of this, at level 10, a cleric will get an ability called Divine Intervention, and in the tabletop version, that basically means they ask their god to help them in some way, and there's a low chance they will, and what they do is pretty much up to the DM. So how do you translate something like that to a video game? Well, here, Larian essentially made this an ability that it would work every time you used it, but you could pick one of its 4 effects and use them one time, period. It was one time per playthrough. Once you used that particular effect, you could never use it again. One of these would, within a large range of the cleric, completely revive and heal every one of the characters around you. So needless to say, that's really powerful, but you can only use it once. And I thought that was a really cool interpretation of that ability in game, and that's just one example of something they do all the time. So broadly speaking, I think they made a really impressive amount of smart changes to things to make them work in the game. Probably my personal favorite for the Warlock class is that they changed the Pack of the Blade class feature at level 3 to allow your Warlock to make a pact with their weapon, essentially, or bond to their weapon, to give them extra effects. However, in the game here, they've changed this to work off the Warlock's primary ability score, which is Charisma, which means you're more likely to hit with a melee weapon by picking Pact of the Blade. But in addition to this, while it didn't outright mention it in the tooltip, Pact of the Blade will also grant you proficiency in any weapon you use it on top of giving you extra attack at level 5, which means that despite there not being a very popular subclass for the Warlock called the Hexblade, you can still do basically that with what they did with Pact of the Blade. So it's a nice sort of compromise, if you will, for them not being able to add every subclass. On a slightly more mechanical level in terms of combat, it's obviously turn-based, which I'm sure you've seen on screen plenty up to this point, which is also how the tabletop version works, and while the previous games were real-time with pause, they've done a lot of work into speeding this up and making it as quick as possible, and while it will occasionally drag here and there, for the most part, I can confidently say as someone who plays loads of turn-based games, this is the best implementation of turn-based I've experienced. It is remarkably smooth. It also has a few hiccups here and there, to be sure, just so I'm not overselling it here. There were times where enemies like across the map would suddenly aggro for some reason, and then I'd have to wait for all their turns. So it's certainly not perfect, but it is very, very good, and I think with a little bit of polishing, this system could be fantastic. Even here, though, we see all sorts of choices and reactivity. Though, right here at the beginning, when you're targeting something with an ability you're about to hit them with, it kind of shows you a general % chance to hit, and then some general modifiers under the enemy's name and health. However, one thing I would like here is a detailed breakdown of the % chance to hit, or at least an option to toggle that on, because while I know the system well enough to adjust it to a point where it's really not a big deal, things like getting to high ground, making sure you're in a well-lit area so you can see the enemy you're trying to hit, not trying to hit them with a bow when you're right next to them, that kind of thing. But it would be really nice to get a proper full breakdown of how that calculation is being made, because for me, someone who really likes numbers, I would appreciate it, though I imagine most people won't care. Beyond that though, while being in combat is pretty straightforward, as it is simply a move and action system where you have a set amount of movement and then you can take an action, a bonus action, and a reaction, you can also do a lot of really fun stuff with it when you start thinking outside the box, because while you can charge in and fight enemies that way, you can also get more creative. You can set up fights beforehand, set up ambushes, throw bombs, traps, other items you can find. You can throw improvised weapons. You can throw your teammates if you have the strength score to do it and get them in melee range. You can play the game as a stealth character with a decent stealth system that works pretty well. It's also possible to solo the game, though I haven't tried that personally yet. It is known to be possible according to Larian. So while I would say the turn-based part of it is really well done, I think what's a lot more interesting is what you can do before the combat even starts, if that makes sense. The setup, how are you approaching it beforehand? Are you coming around the side? Are you utilizing high ground and alternate paths? Or are you the one being ambushed because you didn't see something coming? And there's so so many little variants to that it's really fun to mess around with. Though, on a personal note, before we move on, I just wanted to share my two favorite abilities, which actually wound up being Cloud of Daggers and that Ghoul ability I already mentioned. While there are plenty of really fun abilities, and I used many of them, of course, what I found consistently useful across the entire game was those two when they were available. Because Cloud of Daggers does pretty much guaranteed damage to anything within a small area, and then it persists over time, provided you don't lose concentration on it. And because we're often fighting enemies in small enclosed spaces, you could set up Cloud of Daggers at a choke point as a high-level version of it, and it would just tear through enemies. I probably killed more things in this game with Cloud of Daggers than I did anything else. And like I mentioned earlier, that Ghoul ability I got as a quest reward towards the end of the game was just an I win button. That ability is nuts. And that's just to name a few that I liked personally. That said, from there, let's move on and talk about the gameplay and world a little bit. So you've seen plenty of the gameplay on screen up to this point, so let's talk a little bit about how this works. The game is broken down into ultimately 3 acts, and these are large explorable areas, very large areas. However, you're not going to be traveling around a world map or anything, which is a slight departure from the norms of CRPGs, but consistent with Larian's previous work. And I mention that particularly because at the end of Early Access, when you clicked on the area to leave, it would bring up a sort of world map for a second, but it doesn't look like they went through with that, as the launch version here doesn't have that at all. You just kind of move on to the next area. Eventually, the areas you leave behind will become blocked off, but it takes a while for that to happen. And there are plenty of points where the game will be like, hey, you're about to move on, might want to wrap up anything you left behind. But each of these areas, again, is quite large. There are multiple dungeons, hidden things, hidden interactions, different ways to approach various quests, different people to side with. The city area in particular is several large maps thrown together, and almost every house has something unique to see and do. It was a little overwhelming, to be honest. And even here, we have all sorts of approaches. If you need to get an item from someone, do you pickpocket it off them? Do you break into their house and do it while they're sleeping? Break into their house and kill them when no one's looking? Simply walk up to them and pass an intimidation or deception check to trick them or force them into giving it to you. There's all sorts of ways to approach most things before it even gets to combat. Even when it comes to bosses, there are a few bosses you can kill through dialogue, so to speak. There are fights that can be avoided that way. There are things you can tackle that way. And while that general reactivity is something Larian is known for, what they nailed here is consequences, like I mentioned, because even from the start of the game, you're going to be making decisions that you will see the impact of later in the third act of the game. There are characters you will meet within the first couple hours that may or may not be around towards the end of the game that then have some potential effect on it. And obviously I'll leave that for people to discover, but a lot of times that impact and extra thing gained is significant, which means that it really felt like this game had a lot more consequences just on an individual level with characters, but that's before we even start talking about major decisions like how you handle the major plot threads of each act, which involve much larger things that we're not going to get into. And there's just a huge amount of depth to it. We have a basic justice system where, if you're stealing something or someone catches you doing that, you can potentially get sent to the local jail for it. But stuff like that is just the tip of the iceberg, because what I would encourage people to do with this game is think about what solutions you could possibly come up with to a situation, because things like speak with animals and speak with dead are spells in this game that can potentially lead you to alternative solutions. For instance, there's a murder investigation in one part where using Speak with Dead got me some interesting information. The same can be said with Speak with Animals. And that's to say nothing of the unique side quests or just unique interactions like breaking into the newspaper office in Baldur's Gate to change the headlines. There's a bank you can break into, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And then you get to the city itself, which has all these iconic locations from the previous 2 games and of course just D&D in general. And all of that leads to a very satisfying gameplay experience. That's a little hard to talk about in a shorter video just because of how much there is. Now, before we start wrapping this video up, I want to talk a little bit about the party dynamics and origin characters, on top of just some general stuff. So first of all, the origin characters. If you are not playing them, they are typically companions outside of the Dark Urge. Each of these characters has their own personality. However, if you engage with those characters and make them like you, it can sway how easily easily they are to be influenced by you. This can be seen when you pull up their character sheet. It will show how they feel about you down towards the bottom. And if you mouse over it, it will tell you that they can either be easily convinced to do the things you want, or it will be difficult based on how much they like you again, which means the difficulty check for the roll to persuade them will be easier. So that's something to keep in mind, on top of the fact that all of these characters I felt had a pretty solid character arc, where over the course of their own personal story, they grew and changed in unique and interesting ways. I think Lae'zel's was probably the one I enjoyed the most in terms of character development and change, but all of them had something going on and were pretty interesting. And while one of them, the ending kinda disappointed me, I don't want to get into that for spoilers, but do keep in mind, if you don't like any of the origin characters or something like that, it is possible to sort of sway them to your way of thinking or watch them grow and progress as a character, and I think that adds a lot to the roleplay. So while you might not be best friends right out of the gate, if you take the time to get to know these characters, it feels like they go through a lot of growth, which again is just satisfying to see. But that's to say nothing of how these characters feel about each other, as believe me, they will have opinions and there are unique cutscenes related specifically to that. And beyond just the origin characters, there are other companions to find, some of which include confirmed returning characters such as Jaheira or Minsk, and you can ask those characters what you would expect to ask them about. And all of those characters will also have opinions and quests associated with them, even if they aren't as tied to the main story. Not to mention that all of these characters can just die at any point, so if you don't like any of them, that's also a legitimate option. Like I said, the game can be played solo if you want. But as your journey through the realms moves on and progresses, a lot of that will be reflected by the camp system. The camp both acts as your place to take a long rest, and you can travel there freely outside of, dangerous areas and combat, and that's going to allow you to swap out origin characters as needed very quickly on the fly. And while it serves a very functional purpose as your sort of base of operations when you're out in the field, it's also going to grow and change a little bit. Each character has their sort of own area in the camp, and as that character levels up and progresses, that area will sort of change and grow a little bit to reflect what they've got going on. And then it's also possible to meet a bunch of side characters that will join your camp, and over the course of the game, it really feels like an almost visual representation of the changes that you're seeing happen around you and the story you are telling, which I thought was really cool to see and a nice way to bring the bulk of this review to a close, because that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. On the positive side of things, it's pretty much what you would expect. The size and scope of this game, especially for a CRPG, is immense, and the fact that they succeeded at most of this and pulled it off is really remarkable. All the choice and dialogue, the consequences to various story decisions, the big cinematic moments, the ways you can move about the game world and interact with all these characters in ways that feel sort of instinctual and natural, if that's how you want to do it, really facilitates a level of immersion and role-playing that CRPGs are both known for, but also brings it to what I consider a new height. And in spite of that, there are still a few minor problems. So on the negative side of things, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, I did run into a variety of minor bugs. There was some more serious stuff like a few crashes that are definitely noteworthy. And for some people who have limited time, I could understand them wanting to wait a little while to get stuff like that polished up, as that is certainly the most serious thing I encountered. However, beyond that, while I didn't really mention this elsewhere in the review, I was a little disappointed to see recurring problems from previous Larian games here. The inventory system is still a bit of a mess. They've taken some steps to help with this, such as them automatically giving you a keyring item, an item to store all your camp supplies that you'll need for when you rest, and an item for all the alchemy ingredients, which is a system I didn't even get into because I didn't use it much, but is also a thing, just to show you how immense this game is. And in spite of those things, because they're throwing so much loot at you all the time, most of it is stuff you're going to want to keep track of, and they thankfully give you a storage chest at the camp that will help you manage all of this. The inventory system is a bit of a nightmare, which was a very big problem in Original Sin 2 as well, so I think it's worth calling out. And in a similar vein, we then have the camera. Oftentimes the camera can get hung on scenery, it won't want to move the way you want, or it will get stuck on a floor that isn't the floor you're trying to look at when you're looking at multiple layered buildings. There's times it'll just get stuck on the environment or like plunge down into the map, which is very hard to reset, and the camera could prove to be really annoying at times. And I think those things are especially easy to spot in a game that otherwise really immerses you in what's going on and pulls you into it, only to then be hampered by like camera problems or just seeing a minor bug happen, things like that. And if anything, I think they are more pronounced because of how good the rest of the game is. So they are really noticeable when they do happen. All that said though, we finally come to our conclusion. My conclusion for Baldur's Gate 3 is that Larian set for themselves an incredibly high bar, and outside of a variety of minor issues that I think could be addressed via patches, such as the performance issues or just small little quibbles about the way individual things work, they knocked this out of the park. I loved this from start to finish. This first playthrough of this game was truly something special, and I don't think I'll forget it anytime soon, though I do plan on playing it through many more times for the 100% review. Baldur's Gate 3 is incredibly ambitious, and in my opinion, it succeeds at almost every single one of those ambitions. If you like CRPGs or this genre of games, or you just like games with an emphasis on choice and consequence in general, then I think Baldur's Gate 3 is a must-play that pushes the genre forward, and will almost certainly be remembered as the benchmark to which other CRPGs are compared. With all the talk in recent years about video games being next-gen and this big jump in quality and everything, I think Baldur's Gate 3 is the first game I ever played where that statement was legitimate. So again, for me, this is a must-play, and I sincerely hope everyone watching this enjoys this game half as much as I did. That said, that is pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. But regardless, if you're listening to this part of the video, truly, just thank you so much for watching. As someone who has specialized and covered CRPGs for years upon years, all across the genre and types of games, etc., growing from a small niche channel to being able to bring you a review like this day one for one of the best game series in my favorite genre of games is certainly a wild experience. So with that said, don't forget to let me know how you feel about the game down below. I would of course love to hear how much you're enjoying the game, not enjoying it. I would also really like to know how this game is running for people, because most of the problems I ran into were tech related, even if for me they were bearable. So I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else thought, what their experience was like, and hopefully that the inevitable launch day patch cleared up some of these issues so people can immerse themselves in this otherwise really wonderful experience. That said, that is everything I've got. Again, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.